All right, the final part of our show today, Trevor, is we are going to jump into our opponent preview for Notre Dame and game number 11, the final game at Notre Dame Stadium in the regular season, is November 22nd at 3:30, and that is against the Syracuse Orange. That's it, just Orange. Just so used to them being the Orangemen, being in the Big East and playing basketball. Like that's what I think about when I think of Syracuse. But we're talking football. We're talking the oblong-shaped ball and what Syracuse brings to the table in 2025. Bottom line, Trev, this group is a lot different than they were last year, and there's going to be a lot of change up in Syracuse for sure. And just as a reminder, you are listening to the Irish Breakdown podcast, sponsored and brought to you by FanDuel. And we didn't want to leave that part out. So we're talking Syracuse football here, Trev, and this is going to be an interesting year. Obviously, it's going to be senior day for Notre Dame, when Syracuse comes to town. But man, this is going to be an interesting matchup and an interesting season for Fran Brown in year two.
Yeah, it really is. And I know that we're going to get a lot of questions about it leading up to the game, but is Notre Dame going to let senior day distract them? And no, Marcus Freeman's 3-0 in senior day, and the games have not been that close. They beat Virginia 35-14 last year. They beat Wake Forest 45-7 in 23, and they beat Boston College 44-0 in 2022. So over the span of 3 games, they've allowed 21 points, and they have scored whatever 99 plus 35 is, because my mental math is not that great right now.
134.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What are you, working a school? Come on, guy. Embarrassing me like that? No. Yeah. So, but yes, senior day has not been that big of an issue for Notre Dame in recent years. I think the last closest senior day game they had was like back in 2017. But this is going to be a really interesting year. I mean, we all know what Syracuse did last year. Fran Brown goes into year 2. They go 10-3. They lost some key pieces on offense and defense from a year ago. And we're going to get to it later. But the schedule that they have this year, I believe to be significantly harder than what they had last year as well. You combine that with how much they lost on both sides of the football, we're going to get to see what kind of coach Fran Brown is this year. And I like Fran Brown as a coach. I really do. I like what he's building at Syracuse. It's going to be interesting to see if they can keep it rolling. But last year they burst onto the scene. They had a very high-powered offense. They started out the season 5-1 with a really head-scratching loss to Stanford. That one was odd. They beat Georgia Tech, who was ranked at the time, because they were fresh off of beating Florida State and Ireland. They lose to Stanford 26-24. They rout Holy Cross 42-14. They beat a ranked UNLV team in overtime 44-41. They beat NC State on the road 24-17. Unfortunately, they get the doors blown off of them against Pitt on the road 41-13. That was kind of in like the middle of Pittsburgh's hot streak. And then I think a week after that is kind of when the wheels fell off for Pitt. So could be a timing thing. But Syracuse had an interesting year. After their loss to Pitt, they beat Virginia Tech at home in overtime. They lost to Boston College on the road 37-31. And then they finished out their season on a 4-game win streak. So it's a really interesting year coming up for Fran Brown at Syracuse. I will be very interested to see how they replace what they lost.
Yeah, this is it's almost going to be a completely new roster. It is going to be very, very interesting. There's no doubt about that. And look, I think Syracuse has the opportunity to obviously put up big numbers. I don't know if those numbers are going to be in the win column. I think that's going to be the biggest issue, obviously, for Syracuse moving forward, Trev. And I'll let you kind of get in there about the portal and why this team is going to look so much different this year than it did last year, because it is almost going to be unrecognizable if you're a Syracuse fan or if you are an opponent of Syracuse and what that looks like moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, you go through and you look at their roster and what Syracuse did. They had 24 outgoing players in the transfer portal. They had 16 coming in. Of those 16 coming in, I believe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 8 of them on offense are within the 2 deep, and 5 of them on defense are in the 2 deep. So this is going to be a very new look team. They're also going to be tasked with replacing their top 4 pass catchers from last year. We'll dive more into that.
One. That's the biggest one for me, but we'll, like you said, we'll dive into that one as we go.
We'll dive more into it once we get to the offensive side of the ball. But, the Syracuse team pieced together a good year last year. But, Vince, to your point, it's a completely different looking team. They went 10-3 in Fran Brown's first season, and they won in the postseason. They beat Washington State in the Holiday Bowl in a shootout. I mean, it was like 53-35. It was a high-scoring game. They had really big wins. Their biggest win of the season is they essentially ended Miami's hopes of making the playoffs. They beat them 42-38. They beat Georgia Tech early in the year. They beat UNLV, who played for the Mountain West Championship, 44-41. But again, their losses were just weird. You lose to Stanford 26-24. That was a head-scratching loss. You lose and then your 2 other losses weren't that competitive. And so what is the real Syracuse? Mm-hmm. The biggest question about them, if they're able to keep it rolling, is their roster. The impact of the losses that they had between the draft and the NFL draft and the transfer portal were kind of bigger than like the overall just numbers up top, in my opinion, when you look at the Syracuse roster. But man, you dig into what they lose, and it's just a completely different looking team. Kyle McCord's gone. He led the nation in passing last year. It's going to be interesting to see how they piece it together this year.
Well, speaking of Kyle McCord and the offense, let's dive right into the offense specifically. It is year 2 of offensive coordinator Jeff Nixon, which makes sense because it's also year 2 of Fran Brown. And this is a very, very pass-heavy offense, which is why the aforementioned Kyle McCord was able to put up the numbers that he did, being number 1 in passing yards and number 5 in passing touchdowns last year. I mean, they threw the ball all over the yard, and I would assume they're going to attempt to do that again this year, Trev. And do they have, I mean, we'll get into the quarterbacks in just a second. Do they have the signal caller to do it? But more importantly, do they have the pass catchers to do it?
Yeah, that's going to be the biggest question mark for them. You look at who they lost this past season, and their talent that they had last year at the receiver position helped feed into Kyle McCord being the number 1 quarterback in the country in passing yards. They were the number 1 passing offense in the country in yards per game. They were number 29 in yards per attempt. Syracuse last year in 13 games threw 598 passes in 13 games. That led the country by 36 attempts. And keep in mind, there were teams that played 16 games last year, and they did that in 13.
They threw the ball on average of 46 times a game.
Yeah, I mean, that's insane.
46 times a game.
Now, I'm sure you're asking, well, were they able to run the football? And to that I say, no, they weren't.
No, they weren't.
So, but in all seriousness, you go and you look at what Syracuse did last year. They had an 1,000-yard running back, but it was kind of because he was able to put up some numbers against not great opponents. Syracuse last year, they ranked number 126 in rushing yards per game at 97.6. And they were also not an efficient running team either. They were number 25 in rushing offense and yards per carry. They averaged 3.16 yards per carry. So Jeff Nixon is going to have his work cut out for him this year because he's going to have to find a way to establish the run while breaking in a first-time starting quarterback, whether it's Steve Angeli or Ricky Collins. You combine that with some of the offensive line issues that we're going to get ready to talk about. This makes for a really, really interesting year for the Syracuse offense. Yeah. What identity do you want to have? Do you become a more balanced offense? Because you're not going to want a first-time starter getting into a shootout every single week. Ideally, I know that's more of like a defensive question, but offensively, now you just don't have, as of right now, the tools to be able to get into shootouts with teams every single week. So, Vince, let's kind of switch over here to quarterbacks.
Yep.
Notre Dame is not the only team in college football, contrary to what some people believe, to be having an ongoing quarterback battle in the offseason right now. And Syracuse is another one of those teams. As a refresher, Ricky Collins transferred in. He transferred in from LSU. He was in the winter portal. He was with them all spring. And then, of course, I don't know if any of you guys heard about any of the news, but Steve Angeli also transferred to Syracuse from Notre Dame. He left after the spring. He left in the spring portal window. Odds are Angeli didn't go somewhere he didn't think he was going to start. You know what I mean? Like, especially somebody has 2 years of eligibility left. You know, you got stuff like that. So the quarterback battle at Syracuse is going to be an interesting one. I'll say that, because I'm not entirely sure who their starter is going to be. And I know a lot of the big headlines for a lot of people in this game is, Steve Angeli makes his return to Notre Dame Stadium. But there's been some things out there.
Yeah, we actually talked to a source here in the last 24 hours or so about the quarterback battle at Syracuse specifically. And right now, Ricky Collins is in the lead, followed very closely by Steve Angeli. And look, to be honest with you, the reason is because Ricky Collins was there in the spring. And he has a leg up in that regard. He's had more time in the playbook. He's had more time with the offense. And I would say that's to be expected. To your point, when we talked about this earlier, Trev, I mean, look, Steve Angeli's not going to go someplace where he doesn't have an opportunity to start. And he just kind of replaced one quarterback competition for another one. And Ricky Collins is a good quarterback, and so I think that it is an absolute battle going on over there in Syracuse. Who wins the battle is honestly inconsequential to a lot of different things, but it's very consequential to Syracuse. And they are a very quarterback-driven offense. And so whoever it is that wins that battle is going to have to throw the ball around the yard a bunch. I mean, if they average 46 passes a game, they're going to have to throw the ball a lot. So we'll see. We'll kind of keep an eye out just because they're one of the opponents of Notre Dame. But right now it's a battle. It's an absolute battle, and it sounds like it's fairly neck and neck.
Vince, we're talking about an offense where the quarterback, not once, but twice, had over 60 passing attempts in a game. Do you know how crazy that is? Kyle McCord against UNLV threw the ball 63 times. And then 2 games later, threw the ball 64 times against Pitt. That was a rough game. That was a bad game. That was the game where Kyle McCord threw the ball 64 times, was picked off 5 times, and didn't throw a touchdown. That was a rough matchup for them. I completely forgot that's what that game was. I remember the Pitt game being a very lopsided affair. I just forgot that it's because Kyle McCord turned the ball over 5 times, unfortunately. So,
and that's what happens when you throw the ball as much as they do. You know what I mean? I mean, what did Lou Holtz say? 3 things happen when you throw the ball. 2 of them are bad. I mean, that's reality. And you take those chances when you chuck it around the yard as much as they do. And can Ricky Collins or Steve Angeli do what Kyle McCord did last year? I mean, that remains to be seen as far as I'm concerned. And that's going to have a lot to do with the new pass catchers that Syracuse is going to have, because guys either graduated or they went to different programs. And so you've got a ton of new talent at wide receiver.
That is probably the biggest question that I have with them. It's either their pass catchers or their offensive line. But look, they lost their top 4 pass catchers from last year. They lost Jackson Meeks. He was their leading wide receiver last year. He was their 1,000-yard guy, 78 catches, 7 touchdowns. They lost Trevor Pena to the portal. He's now at Penn State. 84 catches, 941 yards, 9 touchdowns. They lost their tight end, Aronde Gadsden. He's also now in the NFL. He's with the Los Angeles Chargers. He was their 3rd leading receiver. And then running back LaQuinn Allen, who's also now in the NFL, was their 5th leading receiver. So when you lose 4 of your 5 top pass catchers, who do you have coming back? Off the cusp, they have Darrell Gill coming back, and he was their 4th leading receiver last year. He had 31 catches, 570 yards, 18.4 yards per catch, 2 touchdowns. He was kind of their big play weapon. You go through and you look at what he did last year. I mean, he's 6'3", he's a $175, so he's definitely their down the field threat. And so, can he have a breakout season? They also picked up Jonte Cook from the transfer portal. Now, he was with Texas for 2023 and 2024. He didn't do much with them. He hasn't lived up to his recruiting hype yet, but he's getting there. And so, can he be an impact player for the Syracuse offense? He had 2 touchdown catches last year, but they were both against UTSA. And so, I'm going to be very curious to see, are they going to be able to replace the production lost from Trevor Pena entering the portal and Jackson Meeks going off to the NFL? I don't know the answer to that. Regardless of who starts at quarterback for Syracuse, Ricky Collins has a very high ceiling, but we know what Steve Angeli can do as well. If Steve Angeli has weapons like we saw in the Sun Bowl, I think that's going to be interesting to see what he can do with that style of offense. I think just naturally, because of the system he's in, whatever quarterback starts for Syracuse is going to put up a lot of numbers. But a lot of that is going to be dictated, Vince, to your point, by the guys that they're throwing to. And
Sure.
I don't have a lot of confidence in the pass catchers that they have coming back. That's my issue.
Yeah, no, which makes perfect sense. I mean, look, they could prove us all wrong and they could, dominate offensively and put up big numbers again and all of those different things. And you beat me to the punch there, Trevor. But I just I'm not confident that they're going to be able to do that. And a lot of that has to do with the next group that we're going to talk about, and that's the offensive line.
This group for me is probably the biggest question mark on the team now that I think about it. Last year, the offensive line did not perform well. They were number 84 in the country in sacks allowed. They allowed 29 sacks in 13 games. But it's not just their performance overall from last year. I'm also concerned about the makeup of their offensive line. You go through and you break down their depth chart. 4 of their 5 projected starters right now in our lads are transfers. That is tricky. There are some position units where you can get away from being a transfer portal dominant unit. Secondary is a concern, but not overly concerning. There's a good chance that 2 of the 3 starting wide receivers at Notre Dame are going to be transfer portal guys. 2 of the 3 starting wide receivers for Notre Dame last year were transfer portal guys. It doesn't make me crazy nervous, but it does along the offensive line. You have 4 guys that really started playing together as a cohesive unit this summer because some of the transfer guys that they got in came into the spring portal. Very nervous to see what they have going on. I mean, after last season, they lost their left guard, Jacob Branford. They lost their center, Jean-Ray Reed, who actually is now at USC. So Notre Dame will play against him, just not with Syracuse. They also lost their right tackle, Savion Washington. And so you go through and you look at what they're able to do. My biggest concern with them, yes, pass protection is an issue. Last year, they gave up 29 sacks. Some of that, Kyle McCord was not the most athletic passer in the world last year. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call him like a Jack Cohn statue. But I'll say this. Steve Angeli and Ricky Collins are athletic enough to get them out of certain situations. We saw Steve Angeli do that. Ricky Collins, we saw him do that back in high school. Ricky Collins is kind of more of like a Kenny Minchie type athlete. Like he's not a dual threat guy by any means, but athletic enough to get out of pressure. Kyle McCord was not on the athletic level of Steve Angeli nor Ricky Collins. So I think that might help some things a little bit. But I'll say this. If they don't figure out how to become a better run blocking team, whoever starts for them at quarterback is going to have a really, really hard time. And Syracuse is going to have a really difficult time having the season that Fran Brown is going to want to have in year 2. Because if they're not able to establish any sort of ground game, that's going to be a really long year for them. Really long year. A first-time starter. Why, Vince, why are we so confident that whoever starts at quarterback for Notre Dame is going to have a decent season?
Because the O-line and the wide receivers.
And they have a run game.
And a running game. Yeah, right.
Like, it comes down to the tools that whatever starting quarterback takes over has at their disposal. That's my biggest concern for Syracuse. I know the quarterback battle is going to draw the most headlines, and they get Steve Angeli from Notre Dame and Ricky Collins from LSU. Gotta find a way to run the football. They have to be a better running team, because if they're not, it's going to be a really long season offensively for Jeff Nixon in year 2.
Agreed. Let's flip it over to the other side of the football, Trev, and let's talk a little bit of defense. Obviously, the defensive coordinator, Elijah Robinson, is also going into year 2 with the new staff coming in last year. And the defense left a little bit to be desired, I would say, last year. They were scoring a lot of points on offense, but I also felt like they were giving up a lot of points on defense.
Yeah, a lot left to be desired is a very nice way of putting it, Vince. They were bad last year. You have a first-time starter quarterback. You cannot with a a transfer portal offensive line and a completely new group of pass catchers outside of Darryl Gill and a struggling run game, you can't ask this offense to get into a shootout every single week, especially with the schedule that they have coming up. We're getting to that in a second, but that is a mean schedule, by the way.
We'll
Defense has to be better.
We'll definitely get to the schedule. It's going to be tough.
Defense has to be better. Last season, they gave up 41 points to UNLV, 41 points to Pitt, 37 points to Boston College, 38 points to Miami, and 35 points to Washington State. You can't rely on what we just got done talking about with the offense. They can't be counted on to then score 42 points or above every single week. That's going to be a tall order. Last season, Syracuse's defense, they ranked 96th in the country in scoring defense. They ranked 82nd in the country in pass defense. They gave up 227.3 yards per game. They gave up 150.2 rushing yards a game, which ranked 69th in the country. So we're talking about a group that in essentially the three major categories of defensive stats, they were outside of the top 60. And that is an area that absolutely has to improve this year, or else this is going to be a rough one.
Yeah, no, 100%. And the defense as a whole was just rough. They didn't rank in anything lower than 69 in team defensive stats. That has to be better, especially when the offense is probably not going to be putting up the prolific numbers that they did last year. Specifically, let's talk secondary. They're going to have some new guys in the secondary. One is a true freshman. Another is a transfer from Georgia.
Yeah, their secondary has the opportunity to be better than what it was last year because of some of the new faces. Demetrius Samuel Jr., he's expected to start at cornerback. He's a true freshman. He's 6'1". He's a $195. According to On3, he was a top 20 prospect in the state of Florida coming out of high school. From everything that I read, hearing decent things about him out of camp, it's a lot of just he's a true freshman, but athletically he's a really good player. And then opposite of him is going to be Chris Peel. And he transferred from Georgia. He's expected to start at the other cornerback slot. He didn't play a whole lot at Georgia last year. There was a good amount of stuff in front of him too, good amount of players in front of him. But their secondary this year could take a jump. Now, we're talking about a secondary that could take a jump from just not being the number 82nd ranked pass defense in the country. They're going to be facing some pretty good passing offenses this year. But this is a unit that could potentially take a jump. They have experience coming back at the safety position. They bring back their free safety, Deuce Chestnut. They also bring back Devin Grant, who's also their nickelback. But last year, again, they lost a lot. Clarence Lewis graduated. Marcellus Barnes graduated. Jaden Bellamy, one of their corners who led the team in interceptions last year. He entered the transfer portal. So they had some losses there as well. But I do think this unit has the potential to be better than what they were last year. Not only do they have the potential, but they will have to be better than what they were last year.
So with all of the eye-opening numbers defensively, you would assume that there has to be improvement on the front. And the front four definitely has to improve, Trev.
Yeah, I mean, when you go through and you look at what they lost again, their biggest loss up front was probably Murad Watson, biggest loss in the transfer portal. He's a big-bodied guy. I mean, I believe he transferred to Texas, but we're talking to somebody. He was a big run stuffer. He was like 6'3", 6'4", 313 pounds, big body in the middle. And then they lost their most productive edge rusher in Fadil Diggs. He's gone as well. He led the team in sacks at 7.5. He also led the team in tackles for a loss. He had 14 tackles for a loss last season. He now plays for the New Orleans Saints. So the losses on the defensive line continue to stack up for Syracuse. They also lost two of their best linebackers in Justin Barron and Marlowe Wax. They were, if I look at these stats correctly, they were some of the leading tacklers on the team from last season. Deuce Chestnut returns. He's a free safety. He also led the team in tackles. He was their second leading tackler. So Defensive line, though, they're going to need some players to step up. King Joseph Edwards is a returning player for them. He is a pure edge rusher. He's 6'4". He's 225 pounds. He's going to have a big year for him. Last year, he ripped off 3 sacks, and then I believe he was also – okay, so all of his tackles for a loss were his sacks. He had 3 tackles for a loss and 3 sacks. But this defensive line unit is going to have to be better. Again, they're one of the biggest reasons why their rush defense wasn't as good as what it was. It's also a reason why their pass defense just wasn't effective. They weren't able to generate enough pressure. You know, their team leader in sacks last season had 7.5. Their next closest was a linebacker with 4.5. Their defensive line last year combined to have 14 and a half sacks last year across their entire D-line. That's not interior guys. That's not edge rushing guys. That is the defensive line unit as a whole. Yeah, the operation as a whole on the defensive line is going to have to take that next step, because if they don't, it's going to be a really long road for them. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record saying it. Vince, we might as well just bring up their schedule now.
Done.
Because you look at what this team has to do this year and who they have to play. This is a mean schedule. You go and you look at a team like Syracuse, and they're out of conference games. Yes, they play UConn and Colgate out of conference. They also play Tennessee and Notre Dame out of conference. Vince, when you look at this schedule initially, man, what are your first thoughts?
Yeah, so there are a lot of losable games here, was my first thought when I took a look at it, to be honest with you, because, when you open up against Tennessee, now, thankfully for Syracuse, first of all, that's a lot of orange in the stadium, and that's going to be gross, but just wanted to throw that out there. But opening up against Tennessee at a neutral site is the only benefit that they're going to have, but that is going to be a welcome to the 25 season for Syracuse in probably not the most hospitable way that they're looking for. So, that's a tough way to open up your year. Then obviously you get UConn, you get Colgate. Okay, those are probably some layups, but then they have to travel to Clemson, which is obviously not going to be a situation where Syracuse is probably favored. Then they get Duke at home, and Duke won 9 games last year. Then they get to travel down to Dallas, where they face off with SMU, who obviously was a playoff team last year. And then they get to limp into a bye week, most likely, after that stretch of Clemson, Duke, and SMU. And then they have Pitt. And honestly, and Pitt's as much of an enigma in the ACC as anybody. What are they going to be like by October 18th when they travel up to the Dome to take on Syracuse? Like, what is that going to look like? What is that Pitt team going to look like? Then they get to travel down to Georgia Tech, which is not going to be an easy game. I think Georgia Tech is going to be better than their 7-6 record of last year. God only knows what North Carolina is going to be this year under Bill Belichick on Halloween, which I think is probably an apt day to play that game. But who knows what that's going to look like. Then they get to travel to Miami. Then they get another bye week, and then they travel to Notre Dame. Like, that is a kind of a murderer's row schedule, to be honest with you. You and I looked at it prior to the show, and you're like, yeah, there's 7 games here that are probably losses. And when you go into a season like this and you're already predicting a losing season, essentially, and then there's some toss-up games as well, that's not great, especially going into year 2 when you had so much success year 1. Look, Fran Brown's not going to get fired after 2 years, obviously, because he has that year 1 in his back pocket. But I just think they're going to come back to the pack pretty significantly in year 2.
Yeah, I mean, you look at their schedule in its entirety. There are 7 very losable games on here. I mean, you got Tennessee at a neutral site, on the road against Clemson, on the road against SMU, home against Pitt, at Georgia Tech, at Miami, at Notre Dame. There are 7 very potential losses right there. Duke is a 9-win team. That's not a gimme. North Carolina, to your point, we don't know what they're going to be this year, but that's not potentially a gimme. And then their final game of the regular season is at home against Boston College, and that's not a gimme game either, because you have another head coach in Bill O'Brien that is also going into year 2. And if I was just kind of comparing apples to apples here, I like the skilled talent a lot better at Boston College than I do right now at Syracuse. I have significantly less questions about Turbo Richard and some of the guys on Boston College roster than I do about Darryl Gill and Jonte Cook and who the running back is going to be for Syracuse. And so once you kind of break into what this schedule is, like, this is a hard ACC schedule. And then when you throw in on top of it, your 2 out-of-conference games are Notre Dame and Tennessee, that's rough. That is a hard schedule. The Big Ten needs to take notes and look at this schedule and look at what an out-of-conference schedule looks like outside of Ohio State. This is tough. And when you look at it, it's one of those where I know we like to talk about toughest stretches in this, Vince. I think it would kind of be a cop-out to say from, September 27th to November 29th, but this is rough, man. I mean, if I was looking at it legitimately, their season will be made from September 20th to October 4th when they have at Clemson, home against Duke, at SMU. You get no bye week in there. You're on the road twice. I mean, Syracuse only placed 2 teams last year who had losing records. And one of those was North Carolina at 6-7. Now, we don't know what we don't know what they're going to be this year, to your point. But none of these games I look at, and they are not gimmies.
That's correct. They are not gimmies, and there's enough question marks on this team right now as to where you can't look at any of these games as gimmies. We just don't know who the quarterback is going to be. We don't know how effective the wide receiving core is going to be. We don't know what the offensive line is going to look like, or how they're going to play. We know they're going to look like. We just don't know how they're going to play, right? We don't know if the front is going to be better. There's way too many question marks about Syracuse right now, and it's not a reload situation. They're looking a rebuild squarely in the face. And they are working squarely in the portal right now in year 2 of Fran Brown. You expect that in year 1, but they're back at it in year 2. And so they're going to have to get their legs underneath them, and just get a better foundation moving forward. And they were not gifted with a schedule that is going to allow them to kind of ease into year 2. I think that's the biggest thing here. So, Trev, I'm going to ask your prediction here. What do you have them going? How do you see this season playing out for Syracuse?
This is tough because I like Fran Brown. And it was cool to see Syracuse go 10-3 last year. But their schedule from last year compared to this year is significantly more difficult. I'm sorry, their schedule this year compared to last year is significantly more difficult. I mean, last year the most difficult opponent you had on there was Miami, and you were able to scrape out a win towards the end of the year. I mean, you make the argument that if you put that Miami team on this schedule, they're probably your 3rd toughest opponent. And so I go and I look at this team as a whole. I have them going 5-7, and there's also a part of me that thinks that might potentially be on the high end because I have them losing those 7 games that I talked about. Tennessee on a neutral site, on the road against Clemson, on the road against SMU, home against Pitt, at Georgia Tech, at Miami, at Notre Dame. So then you have toss-up games, and then assuming they beat, I think it's safe to say that they beat UConn and Colgate, so chalk them up to 2 wins there. But then again, that means I also have them beating Duke, I have them beating North Carolina, and I have them beating Boston College. And the Duke-Boston College mix is I can't even confidently say they're going to win those.
I feel like those are 50-50 at best right now.
Yep.
At least the Duke game. Maybe the Boston College game is maybe 60-40 in favor of Syracuse, but I think they're going to be better than they were last year. I just think Duke is going to be a better team than Syracuse. And again, that's a 50-50, but it's their home game. So maybe that, gives Syracuse a bit of an edge. That's tough. That's a tough one for me to predict that they're going to get Duke. But we'll see. We'll see. Honestly, a lot of it hinges on how they come out of that Clemson game. Are there going to be any injuries? Are there, how are they going to limp out of that Clemson game? What does that look like after going down to Death Valley and playing the Tigers? Like, that's going to be tough.
Yes. And in all seriousness, the Tennessee game is going to be really interesting to me because it's on a neutral site. They benefit from not getting them in Neyland Stadium. Tennessee's a question mark. They lost a lot. They've got some locker room issues. I'm not as sold on Joey Aguilar as some other people are. I mean, we're talking about a kid that threw 14 interceptions at App State, and now he's coming in to play SEC football. Yeah. That's a big question mark for me. Yeah. I'm not saying that he's going to do bad, but I'm going to be interested to see what that transition is from Nico to Joey Aguilar. But could that be a potential winnable game for Syracuse? Maybe, but I'm not going to, as you like to say, bet the mortgage on it. I don't feel confident in doing that. So like, let's say they're 2-1 going into on the road against Clemson. That stretch from September 20th to October 4th is going to be very telling. If they go 1-2 from that, I think that's a good, if they are 1-2 in that stretch between at Clemson, home against Duke, at SMU, but they're competitive in the losses.
Sure.
I think they'll have something to hang their hats on because it is a rebuilding year for Fran Brown for everything that they lost in the portal last year and a lot of question marks coming in from the transfer portal. But if it's a scenario where it's like it was against Pitt last year where they lost 41-13, it's just not that competitive. You can't afford a Stanford type loss like you had last year.
Yeah, agree with that.
And that's what makes this schedule really scary for me, is if they're not competitive against Clemson and, you're kind of competitive with Duke and you lose at SMU, the wheels might completely fall off to where that North Carolina game this year on Halloween could be your Stanford loss from last year. Because unfortunately for them, that stretch of October, really coming out of the bye week, Pitt at Georgia Tech, you may potentially get a break with North Carolina and then on the road against Miami. I mean, that is brutal. That is brutal. And with the team, the thing I always get concerned about is when you have a team that is strictly made up of transfer portal players, I get worried about losing the buy-in. That's kind of where you have to trust Fran Brown and the players that he's bringing in. But again, he's bringing in players that I'm hoping remain bought in if this season doesn't go the way that they were hoping that it was. But I ultimately have them going 5-7, and there's a part of me that thinks that could be on the high end.
Yeah, I guess I'm not as optimistic as you, but only by a game. I had 4-8 kind of written down over here as far as, what I see this schedule. Look, could they, sneak up on somebody and just throw the ball all over the yard and take advantage of a poor secondary or maybe an injured secondary or something along those lines? And this is going to be tough. This is a tough bounce back year, or I should say this is going to be a tough year to follow up the kind of year that they had last year in year one. And I think Syracuse fans hopefully understand the schedule that they are going to run into this year as opposed to last year. And they understand the personnel as well. And if they do, in fact, go 4-8 this year, they give Fran Brown an opportunity to continue. Because I think Fran Brown's a good coach. I agree with you on that one. Give him an opportunity to continue to build this program the way he wants to build it and maybe not be as dependent on the portal as he had to be this year. Do you know off the top of your head how much time Ricky Collins has left as far as eligibility? Because we know that Steve Angeli has a couple of years, so they could have an actual returning quarterback, going into 26.
I'm almost positive that Ricky Collins is I think he's like a redshirt sophomore this year.
Okay, so either way, whoever ends up being the starter, they're going to have multiple years of eligibility. That's a good thing, that they're not going to keep going to the portal, for quarterbacks. Then that will allow them to potentially develop one, of their own as well to take over for whoever, wins the job this year too.
Yeah. If Fran Brown, I'll say this, if Fran Brown goes 6-6 against his schedule, I know he won't get the recognition for it, but that is like a coach of the year type of job if he goes 6-6 against his schedule. I truly mean that.
I completely agree. Because you're looking at the schedule, like, okay, where are the guaranteed wins, right? UConn, Colgate probably. I would think North Carolina, that's 3. Where do you go from there? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, if he goes 6-6, that means he beats UConn, like per my prediction. That means he beats UConn, Colgate, Duke, UConn, Colgate, Duke, North Carolina, Boston College, and then one of Tennessee, Clemson, SMU, Pitt, Georgia Tech, Miami, or Notre Dame.
Right.
I mean, that's a heck of a coaching job, compounded with everything that was lost, and a head coach going into year 2. So
yeah,
that would be a heck of a coaching job. I'm rooting for Fran Brown, but this schedule's rough.
Yep. Nope. I agree with you. So I got 4-8. You got 5-7. We will see what happens with Syracuse and what they look like, come November 22nd when they face off against Notre Dame at 3:30 on Senior Day, in South Bend, and what that looks like. Syracuse is going to be. They're going to be one of two ways, Trev. Either they're going to be riding high or they're going to be limping into that game, and so. I don't think Notre Dame overlooks them and that kind of deal, but it's going to be interesting for this Syracuse team for sure. So that's going to do it for our Syracuse prediction show. Make sure you hit the like button, the subscribe button, that notification bell, share with your family and friends, and of course, jump on the premium message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. That is where you will find breaking news and all of those different things that you may not find elsewhere. And all of the information coming out of fall camp and position battles and what we're hearing and just all the fun stuff that is Notre Dame football. And we appreciate everybody hanging out with us on the Irish Breakdown podcast presented by FanDuel. It is an awesome partnership that we have with FanDuel now, and they are sponsoring our show and will be for the foreseeable future. So really looking forward to that relationship, and obviously looking forward to the Notre Dame season as well. 24 days away from opening kickoff. Trev, it's going to be here before you know it, man. Really looking forward to it. So appreciate everybody for hanging out with us again. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, share with your family and friends. For Trevor, I'm Vince, and we will talk to you next time on the Irish Breakdown podcast presented by FanDuel.